Hey, English 3 gang. I'm going to start by warning you that my webcam has been kind of misbehaving. So if the picture drops out on me at some point, don't worry, you'll still hear my voice and the video should be fine. So we're going to start a new unit. This unit is broken up into two bits. The first bit is going to focus on transcendentalism, which is a big word we'll talk about in just a couple minutes. The second half of the unit is going to focus on the Gothics. I'm doing all the notes in one fell swoop here today. However, you will get these notes in two parts as far as class goes. So please pay attention to the timestamps that have been assigned in Google Classroom to make sure that you don't overload yourself with information here, okay? Part one today will be the Transcendentalists and a little bit of the Romantics. And then part two will deal with the Gothics, okay? So let's have a start of a conversation about the Transcendentalists. Both of these groups are what I kind of classify as individualists. That's a Briggsy term, not like an official literary term, but I call them that because we are living in a post-revolutionary world. And, we talked about in the previous unit with the Puritans, their belief that their destinies were predetermined, that God already had it all figured out for them. And we also talked in our last little unit about argumentative essays, looking at that Patrick Henry speech, how he's sort of telling people to take their fates into their own hands because that's what God wants them to do. These are two really different ideas. The idea that no matter what we do, it's totally out of our control. And then there's this idea that no, like we control our destinies. And if you think about which one of those two things is more American, it's definitely the second one, this idea that the individual, hence individualism, that the individual is in control of their own destiny or their own fate is the more American idea. We believe that if we just work hard enough, if we work long enough, if we have the right connections, if we have a good enough idea, that we can hit it at any time. We can break big. We can make money. We can be rich. We can have the lives that we've dreamed of. And the Puritans just didn't believe that. So somehow we got from this Puritan belief that our fates are predetermined to this idea of free will. And really, it's the revolution that changes that. Patrick Henry says, if we take our fate into our own hands, we'll see great success. And we do. We win the war and we get our independence. And it's totally human nature that when you try something new and it works, you tend to do that thing over and over again. And that's kind of what the early history of America is like. It's us trying to take our fate into our own hands, succeeding and being very successful as a result of that. It's sort of what creates this American dream, this American spirit that we've got. So we're going to look at the earliest rumblings of this. At least as it pertains to like the literary world. So Transcendentalism and the Gothics, these are not, widespread ideas. There's not a ton of people who are living their lives this way. These are small groups, but these small groups are representative of some of the changes in the way that American people and writers and thinkers that are occurring in our country in the early to mid 1800s after the Revolutionary War. So let's dig in. The Romantics. So we're going to talk a little bit about the Romantics. There was a Romantic literary movement in America. There also was a Romantic literary movement in Europe, and they really weren't different. So I'm going to discuss the Romantics for like 2 minutes here, just to give you kind of a baseline. This wasn't a uniquely American literary movement, and we're not going to talk a lot about the Romantics. But the Transcendentalists were born from this movement, which is why I want to talk a little bit about this. So this just basically talks about the idea of romantic in the 1800s is not the same thing that you're thinking about. You hear the word romantic and you think love. Romantic really was a word that meant dramatic, over the top, fluffy, and this type of literature, this poetry was very romantic. I mean, everything was very dramatic and very over the top. It couldn't just be a flower. It had to be the most beautiful flower in the world. And then they'd spend an entire poem describing how beautiful the flower is. It's that kind of thing. So that I like to give people themes and big ideas, and then we look for it in the writing. Again, we're not going to spend a lot of time on the Romantics, but I am showing you the seven major themes of Romanticism, because Transcendentalism, which was a uniquely American literary movement, is going to borrow some of these from the Romantics. So just a quick run through. They believe in the power of the imagination. In other words, the human imagination is what gives value to pretty much everything on Earth. Without the human imagination to perceive the Colorado Rocky Mountains as beautiful, they aren't beautiful. They're just a big heap of rocks, right? Like it's the human imagination that gives value to all these beautiful things. There's no beauty without humans to perceive it as beauty. Speaking of beauty, they also love things that are picturesque, which is a fancy pants way of saying they like to talk about and write about things that are pretty to look at. They're very patriotic. A lot of them they write poems about being glad to be from whatever country they're from. They don't typically, but they can often focus on things in nature. I think picturesque and nature kind of go together in some ways. Nature often is pretty and worthy of taking pictures, or I guess in the 1830s, painting pictures. There's a big focus on the individual, which we've kind of talked a little bit about already, the idea that we control our own fates, that we have free will, that we are in control of our own destinies. They do have a belief that supernatural stuff is possible. I think for most of you, Supernatural is maybe a TV show that you've seen before, but the word supernatural, super is a prefix that means beyond. Natural is the root word of natural is nature. So we're talking about things that go beyond nature. Ghosts or supernatural spirits, monsters, things like that. In fact, Frankenstein and Dracula were both novels that were written during the Romantic era in Europe. So technically, Frankenstein and Dracula are romantic stories. They're also Gothic stories, but they are written during the Romantic era. So there's that. And then idealism is just a fancy way of sort of seeing the world as a glass half full kind of situation. So they're always looking on the bright side of things. This was born out of something called classicism in Europe, classic literature, which is the most boring. I took a classic lit class in college, and it was my least favorite class. It's so boring. The Romantics kind of came out of that to be less boring. They wanted more exciting and interesting things to talk about. They wanted to find the beauty in the world, both in nature and in people. And I put here, they want us to stop and smell the roses, as it were. That's the heart of the Romantics. Okay, so that's happening in Europe. There's also some of that happening in America, but it's just basically, it's the same thing that's happening in Europe, just in America. It's not like a uniquely American thought process or philosophy or style of writing. But Transcendentalism is a uniquely American type of writing and thinking. So what we've got with Transcendentalism, I say a small handful of American thinkers on this slide. We're talking like a group of friends in Concord, Massachusetts, who get together and they pull some of their favorite things from Romanticism and they add a twist. I'll get to the twist here in just a second, but if you look at this slide down here, sort of the three main tenets of Transcendentalism are that they believe in the power of the individual. So like I said, they believe that the individual controls their own fate. The individual is capable of doing great things if only they set their mind to it, which if you look back at the previous slide, that would be number 5. So they stole that from the Romantics. They often focus on nature. They think that nature has a lot to show us to make our lives better. And if we look back, nature there is number 4. And they also believe in the goodness of humanity. They believe that human nature is generally good, that people are capable of good and want to do good and be good and work together. And if we go back a couple slides, that lines up with number 7, idealism, seeing the world as a very positive place, always looking on the bright side. So they pull those 3 things, and they definitely put their own twist on them. But here's the big overall twist. This is what makes it different. The root word of Transcendentalism is transcend. And transcend is a fancy way of saying to rise above. So like Buddhists, for example, believe that if they meditate long enough and say Om, for a long time, that they'll transcend normal reality and go to some different plane of existence. That's what it means. The idea is that if they believe if people can live their lives according to these three ideas, power of the individual, love of nature, and trust in the goodness of humanity, that if people can fully live according to those three things, that they can transcend to a higher plane of existence. They're going to be better, happier, more well-rounded, better developed human beings. And all the dumb people in the world who can't do those things are basically sheep who are just going along with the flow. These are sort of the dudes who came up with this idea. Ralph Waldo Emerson is like the guy. A lot of these meetings of the Transcendental Club, yes, there was an actual club called that, happened at Ralph Waldo Emerson's house. And Thoreau, the neckbeard over here on the right, was sort of his protege, but was every bit as involved in the Transcendentalist movement. There were other writers and poets living in and around that area who took part in these conversations, but these are the two guys who wrote the most famous essays and have kind of lingered as being the most famous ones. All right, let's break down what these three beliefs mean specifically as they pertain to Transcendentalism. Because like I said, we're going to spend this unit looking at a bunch of different types of writing in search of these three beliefs in the writings. So here's the first one, is this idea that the individual is powerful. So the first part of this is they don't want to wait for God to decide what happens. They want to take control of things themselves. We kind of discussed that, right? It's not predestination anymore. It's free will. The second bullet here, though, is a little gutsier, and we're going to for sure look at this over the course of the next week or so here. They believe that every individual is the best judge of what's right and wrong. Usually, we leave that up to government and religion to tell us what's right and wrong. But the Transcendentalists think that sometimes government and religion can actually be wrong in their assessment of what's morally good. And so they believe that every individual, every human being needs to decide based on their heart and their experiences what's the right thing to do and what's the wrong thing to do. That a religion and a government can offer suggestions, but like you should never be obligated to take those suggestions. They say some truly gutsy things about going against religion, about breaking the law, if those things are making you do unjust stuff. They're making you be what you believe to be immoral. We'll for sure talk more about that as this unit goes on, but that's a gutsy idea for sure. As far as love of nature goes, they don't just like pretty things in nature. It goes deeper than that. First and foremost, they think that a lot of people who practice religion are so focused on what comes after you die, this idea of trying to get to heaven and avoiding hell, that they miss the beauty of the world that is here right now. God's creation is in nature, and they often compare nature to literal heaven. And we'll, again, talk more about that this unit. This idea that God made this beautiful planet for us to experience, and yet we think about heaven in terms of the afterlife when really there's heaven here all around us. The second bullet is that they believe that to feel close to God, you're actually better off placing yourself in God's creation, in this nature, than you are being in church or reading the Bible. Again, that's a gutsy thing to say. These people actually are Christians, so it's not like they're against going to church and reading the Bible. They did those things. They just think that if you want to be close to God, go exist in God's creation. Go be overwhelmed by how beautiful a mountain range is, or by how beautiful a pasture is, or a field of flowers, right? That's how you feel overwhelmed and close to God, not necessarily through going to church or reading the Bible. And lastly, they believe that there's just a simplicity to nature that we should be able to apply to our everyday lives. When you're hunting or fishing or camping, you're not worried about work. You're not worried about, all the emails you got to check and, who's mad at you or what are, social issues, none of that stuff. You truly are focused on do I have enough food? Do I have a safe place to sleep, right? Am I not going to get eaten by a bear, and your life is just so simplified in nature, and they want to try and apply that simplicity to life outside of nature as well. So we'll talk more about that this unit too. And then the third one is just belief that humans are basically good. We know the Puritans, if you guys remember, believe that humans equal evil, that if you stripped down humans to just basic human nature, that the Puritans believed they would be evil, that they would steal and rob and kill. But the Transcendentalists kind of believe the opposite, that if you dropped people into the woods and had them start over, that they would still figure out how to work together and help each other and share and do the right kinds of things. It's just a different way of seeing the world. They also believe that, think back to some of those Puritan sermons where it's always like, God can't wait to cast you to hell. Like he can't wait for you to do something bad so he can send you away. The Transcendentalists are more of like a New Testament kind of crew. The idea that God respects us and is rooting for us to make good decisions. And again, that kind of goes back to this idea of free will, that our fates are not predetermined, that God has given us free will and he's like keeping his fingers crossed for us that we're going to use that free will to make good decisions. And lastly, they believe that we all can be better versions of ourselves. This is a really important part of Transcendentalism. The idea that we can be great, we can do awesome things, we can improve our lives, but that we make those changes from ourselves, not from waiting for God to make them for us. The Puritans might say, I trust that God will provide. And Transcendentalists are more like, I'm going to go out and get this money myself. I'm going to go out and be a better person. I'm going to go and do great things myself. I'm not going to wait for God to present an opportunity. I'm going to go create the opportunity, which is a very different way of seeing things. So if you didn't notice this already, you certainly will have noticed this now. Transcendentalism is basically like a direct opposite of being the Puritans. So the Puritans believe that humans are basically evil, and these guys believe humans are born basically good. The Puritans believe that God makes all our decisions for us, predestination, and the Transcendentalists believe that we have free will to make our own decisions. The Puritans believe that the structure of the Bible is the best way to get close to God, and the Transcendentalists believe that living in nature is the best way to be close to God. I mean, it's very, very much a different view of the world, but it's progression. Like life goes on. We weren't going to always have every person in America live their lives like the Puritans did. We saw last unit, there's a lot of things to admire about the Puritans, but it wasn't a perfect way of life. So what we have in early America in the 50 years following the revolution is we have some people who are experimenting with new ideas and are starting to kind of lay the groundwork for that American spirit, right? So that's the Transcendentalists. We're going to break the video here. I'm going to continue with the Gothics, and you'll come back to that later in the unit. But for today, you can stop watching the notes and go ahead and work on the next part of the assignment. And when we get to the Gothics, I'll give you a timestamp as to where to pick things back up. Okay, so let's move on to the Gothics. Okay, the second part of this unit, after we've talked about the Transcendentalists here for a week or so, is to get into the Gothics, which students typically enjoy quite a bit because it focuses on Edgar Allan Poe, who had some dark stuff going on, and he's certainly one that's worth looking into. So second part of this unit, we're looking again, remember, at like this idea of individualism, where people control their own fates instead of having those fates dish out to them by God, right? Another way to look at that is through the Gothics, who shared some ideas with Transcendentalists, but also had some very different ideas. So here are our three big themes for the Gothic unit. The first one is that, like the Transcendentalists, they believe that humans have free will. They just tend to believe that humans use that free will to do evil, that when they make choices, that their choices are bad choices. The second one, a lot of Gothic stories love to experiment with what happens when you crank up a human emotion to like its highest point, right? So when we are as angry as we've ever been, what happens? Or when a human is as scared as they've ever been, what happens? Or when a human is in love or more in love with someone than they've ever been, what happens? And I think, when our emotions are cranked all the way up, when the volume is turned all the way up on our emotions, positive emotions and negative emotions, right? Ranging from jealousy and anger to love and excitement and happiness. If we turn the volume all the way up and don't control ourselves, bad things tend to happen. And the Gothics like to experiment with that. When we are so scared, as scared as we've ever been, we tend not to make smart choices. And when we are so in love as we've ever been, we tend to make bad choices. And so a lot of these stories center around those bad choices, to kind of get a sense of what humans do to experiment with that. And lastly, they do believe in the supernatural. If you remember way back when we talked about the Romantics, that was something that the Romantics believed in as well. Dracula, Frankenstein, those were written in Europe during the Romantic era. While here in America, shortly after that, looking at the Gothics, we certainly had our own Gothic stories here, and Edgar Allan Poe is a great example of having stories with things that physically can't happen in nature. That supernatural aspect is really important, and that supernatural aspect is sort of the birth of the modern horror genre. A lot of our favorite, most classic horror movies of all time have supernatural elements to them. Ghosts or killers that come back to life to haunt people, or baby dolls that turn murderous. I mean, it's always something that's not physically possible, to kind of mess with our psyche and make us feel afraid. So that's the gist of Gothics. You obviously know this guy. This is Edgar Allan Poe. I think you read The Telltale Heart and The Raven when you were in middle school. Nice little introduction. We're going to look at some more Edgar Allan Poe during this unit. So Poe himself was a Gothic writer. He wasn't the only Gothic writer, but he certainly was the most famous Gothic writer. He had a hard life. Like, he fought depression. He abused some alcohol and some other substances over the course of his life. I mean, he was into gambling. His parents died when he was like 3, and he lived with foster parents who never actually legally adopted him. He fell in love with women who would die on him. It was a rough life for Edgar Allan Poe. And when you have a dark life, you tend to write some dark stuff. But we'll look at a couple different Gothic writers. All of them, Poe, as well as other Gothic writers, will focus on these things. Free will for evil, the human heart is dark when faced with strong emotions, and belief in the supernatural. Poe focuses on those, as do other Gothic writers. But Poe specifically has some motifs that are specific to him. So we'll look for these in Poe's writing as well. First and foremost, in a lot of Poe stories, the setting usually takes place at night, and in a big home. And you think about like a suspenseful, scary story, that's ideal for that kind of story because there's just so much unknown. A scary story in a well-lit one-bedroom apartment isn't really all that scary. You hear a bump in the night, you check the other room, there's nothing there, and you move on with your lives, right? But a bump in the night in a room that has multiple staircases, multiple entrances and exits, tens of bedrooms, old decrepit furnishings and creaks in the boards, and that just creates a scarier ambiance. And so Poe for sure liked this idea of big houses at night, so there'd be more mystery involved as to what that bump in the night really is. Poe also likes to dabble with male characters who've got a screw loose. Typically insane male characters, and not always, but a lot of the time, there is a main character who starts off okay and starts to lose it, or starts off with like a condition that they've kind of kept in check for a long time, and then over the course of the story starts to lose it. If you think about The Telltale Heart, which if you've forgotten the plot of that story, a gentleman murders someone and buries them beneath the floorboards, and over the course of the story, he hears the heartbeat of the murdered person from the floorboards and eventually goes nuts and turns himself in. That kind of thing happens all the time in Edgar Allan Poe stories. I think he dealt with some mental health issues, and so he probably explored a little bit of that in his stories. And then thirdly, very often, the beautiful women are either dead or dying in his stories. I said a few minutes ago, he kept falling in love, and those women kept dying on him, and so he explores that in his writing as well. Women who pass away or are really sick. That happens a lot, where like a woman will be described as like really gaunt and frail, at some point, or she's ill in the beginning, and over the course of the story, she gets sicker and or dies. It happens a lot in a lot of Poe stories. Okay, we talked about romanticism and transcendentalism in the first slideshow. We looked at the Gothics here. They all kind of fall under this umbrella of individualism, because what the Romantics, the Transcendentalists, and the Gothics all have in common is that they believe that humans determine what happens to them in their lives. The Transcendentalists and Romantics believe that we control our fate for good. The Romantics believe that we're responsible for our own downfalls ultimately, but what they all share is this idea of free will, that we are individuals who make our own choices. That is a departure from the Puritan belief of predestination, and it's why I call this unit individualism, because Romantics, Transcendentalists, and Gothics, they all kind of share that in common. One important note is that none of these isms deny the existence of God. I know it seems like they do sometimes, but more the focus is on the potential of people instead of fates predetermined by God. And so, just a little note here, you can see that the individuals, the Romantics were in Europe and a little bit in America. The Transcendentalists were in America, and the Gothics were in both. Okay, so you got everything you need to look at some Edgar Allan Poe stuff over the course of the next week or so, and we'll start digging for those themes. All right, go ahead and check Classroom for what comes next, and thanks for listening.